The first morning, Olivia Bennett officially ran the company. She walked into the operations center and saw a man asleep at his desk. His head rested on his forearms, surrounded by 24 monitors, alive with scrolling alerts. She did not ask questions. She did not check the screens. She did not give him a single moment to open his mouth. In front of the entire technical floor, she ordered his access badge confiscated and ended his employment on the spot. Andrew Foster had barely lifted his head when she cut him off completely. Only hours later, as the payment infrastructure began collapsing layer by layer, would Olivia understand that the man she had just fired was the only reason the company had survived the previous 48 hours. Aurelius Pay was not a company where a few slow minutes were a minor inconvenience. It was a large financial technology firm that processed corporate payments, high-speed wire transfers, and transaction authentication for thousands of clients across the United States. The system ran without meaningful pause, and even a brief failure carried the potential for tens of millions of dollars in losses and the kind of reputational damage that took years to repair. The infrastructure was the company. Everything else was window dressing built around it. Andrew Foster carried the title of Senior Systems Engineer, though that title communicated almost nothing about what he actually did. He was 34 years old, quiet in the way that people who have seen enough stop needing to announce themselves, and entirely uninterested in the internal politics that consumed most of his colleagues. New employees who encountered him usually assumed he was unremarkable, solid but dated, always slightly rumpled, eyes carrying the faint darkness of chronic undersleep, a cold cup of coffee perpetually forgotten near his keyboard. He was not a man who understood the art of making himself visible. The people who had worked alongside him for years held a different understanding. Andrew knew Aurelius Pay's infrastructure the way a surgeon knows a patient they have operated on multiple times. He understood the old AP1 layers that dated back nearly a decade, the failover logic that 3 different CTOs had promised to modernize and never had, the access control structures that had been patched by hand across multiple transitions, and the fragile interdependencies that existed only because someone once built a solution to a problem that no longer existed, but whose removal would have caused something worse. He was the institutional memory the company had never bothered to formally document. To the organization, he was a line on an org chart. To the system itself, he was the only person who truly knew where all the load-bearing walls were. Outside the office, Andrew was the sole parent of Chloe Foster, a 7-year-old who was quiet and perceptive, old enough in her manner to occasionally unsettle adults who expected children to be simple. His wife had died several years earlier after a prolonged illness. Since then, Andrew had rebuilt a life around 2 fixed points: keeping Chloe cared for and keeping his job stable enough that she never felt the absence of anything essential. He did not cultivate allies inside the company. He did not know how to perform the small social rituals that turned colleagues into advocates. He showed up, he worked, he went home. That was the shape of his life, and he had made a kind of peace with it. On the other side of the hierarchy stood Olivia Bennett, 29 years old, recently installed as chief executive after her grandfather stepped back from management due to declining health. Olivia was legitimately accomplished, sharp, well-credentialed, with a track record in investment analysis and corporate strategy that she had earned rather than inherited. She had spent years proving herself in rooms where people expected her to fail, but leading Aurelius Pay was categorically different from anything she had done before. This was a complex, aging, high-stakes operational machine, and she was stepping into it during a transition the company had not fully prepared for. The pressure to prove she was not merely a name on a family tree was enormous, and it shaped every instinct she brought to the role. She made decisions quickly and decisively, and she despised visible indiscipline. It reminded her of everything she was determined to eliminate. In her first week, she announced a comprehensive operational review, a tightening of standards, and a cultural reset she described as moving the company from comfortable to accountable. Beneath the surface of that agenda, in the lower corridors of the technical infrastructure that Olivia had not yet had time to fully examine, something had already begun to go wrong. 2 days before the morning that would define everything, Andrew noticed something unusual in the transaction authentication logs. It was small at first, a cluster of irregular requests, appearing at low frequency within the international processing queue, mimicking the rhythm of legitimate internal traffic with enough precision that automated filters had dismissed them entirely. But Andrew saw it. The pattern was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate immediately, but impossible to ignore once recognized. These requests were not attempting to overwhelm the system or trigger visible errors. They were learning it. He traced the activity backward and identified a deliberate, methodical intrusion. Someone had obtained access to a secondary service at the edge of the architecture, a low-priority authentication relay that handled a narrow subset of cross-border payment verifications. From that foothold, they had been quietly probing deeper, testing what the relay could reach, establishing a path toward more central systems. Their goal was not immediate destruction. They were waiting for the right moment to intervene in a high-volume processing window, redirect funds, or disable the reconciliation mechanisms entirely. Andrew escalated through his direct manager. The manager, acutely aware of how poorly timed a major incident report would land the day before a new CEO took the helm, asked Andrew to continue monitoring and avoid creating alarm before anything was confirmed. The message, politely delivered, was essentially a request to stay quiet and hope the problem resolved itself. Andrew did not comply in any meaningful sense. He began building temporary isolation barriers around the segments he had identified as compromised. He constructed manual redirect layers to absorb suspicious traffic without triggering visible failures. He hot-patched individual nodes, working through the architecture the way someone shores up a sinking structure, not with blueprints and proper materials, but with whatever was at hand, done with enough care to hold. The difficulty was that the infrastructure was ancient in technology terms, accumulated through years of partial upgrades and emergency fixes, and there was no safe way to take it offline and clean it. Keeping the company operational while defending it simultaneously meant working without a net on a live system with no margin for significant error. The 48 hours that followed were the kind of sustained endurance that most people never experience. Andrew barely left the operations floor. He drank whatever coffee was available, ate from vending machines, and changed his shirt in the technical staff bathroom near midnight. His colleagues saw him there continuously, registering his presence the way people register a familiar fixture, assuming he was managing a routine escalation. Nobody understood the scale of what he was actually doing. Andrew was not patching a bug. He was keeping an entire system alive through sheer will, experience, and the kind of institutional knowledge that cannot be transferred in a briefing. Late in the second night, he discovered something that shifted the situation from serious to existential. The attackers had embedded a delayed activation mechanism inside processing cluster, a dormant trigger that would remain invisible during normal operations, but would fire automatically if anyone performed a standard system restart. Under ordinary circumstances, a restart was routine maintenance, used constantly to clear memory accumulation and resynchronize services. If anyone performed that restart without knowing about the trigger, every temporary defensive layer Andrew had built would collapse, the dormant pathway would open, and the attack would enter its active phase. Andrew wrote it all down. He built a file of technical notes, time-stamped log summaries, patch annotations, and explicit warnings. He intended to deliver them directly to executive leadership in the morning, regardless of what that required in terms of bypassing normal channels. He was going to make someone understand, but the body has limits that override intention when pushed past them, and Andrew had been running for nearly 2 full days without real sleep. Sitting before the running log display, waiting for the morning shift to arrive, he put his head down for one moment and did not come back up. Olivia arrived at the operations center at 7:45 as part of a self-directed tour of the company's critical infrastructure. She wanted to see the organization without filters, without the prepared presentations department heads would have assembled for. A formal walkthrough. She walked through the cold, brightly lit floor past rows of monitors and tired engineers finishing overnight shifts, and stopped when she reached the center console. A man in a wrinkled shirt was asleep at his desk. The screens around him were active, a mix of status indicators, amber warnings, and fast-scrolling log output that meant nothing to her without context. What Olivia saw was a symbol of everything she had come to change, a person sleeping at the most sensitive station in the company's infrastructure was an indictment of the culture she was inheriting, careless, unaccountable, self-satisfied. She did not pause to interpret the monitors. She looked at the badge holder on the desk, read the name, and called it out clearly. Andrew jolted upright. For several seconds, he was genuinely disoriented, head heavy, eyes dry and painful, ears filled with a low ringing as his body fought back toward consciousness. He had not yet fully located himself when Olivia spoke again, and the words landed with a sharpness that cut through the fog. "This company does not pay anyone to sleep on the job." Every engineer in earshot stopped moving. Andrew steadied himself, recognized the woman from the company announcement he had seen the previous week, and understood immediately what he was dealing with. He spoke before she could continue. "You need to hear what I have to say about the core payment cluster." "Please don't." Olivia cut across him without hesitation. "I don't need to hear anything on my first morning. Security collects his access card. HR, initiate termination immediately." Andrew looked at her not with fear, not with desperation, but with the specific urgency of someone watching a preventable disaster approach. He tried once more. If someone restarts the system, Olivia had already turned her attention to the security officer moving toward him. "I've said everything I'm going to say." The room stayed silent. Several engineers who had been on shift for hours, who knew Andrew had been there nearly the entire time, said nothing. Speaking against the new chief executive in her first hour would have been a professional act of extraordinary boldness that none of them could bring themselves to perform. Andrew removed his badge slowly, without argument. He did not raise his voice. He did not list what he had done. He asked for nothing. Before he walked out, he looked at a younger engineer named Daniel standing nearby and said 4 words clearly. Enough for several people to hear. "Do not restart it." Someone thought he was being dramatic. Someone else assumed it was the bitter parting remark of a man who felt wronged. Olivia did not register it as anything meaningful at all. She had already filed the morning as a necessary act of leadership, the first clean signal that the era of comfortable negligence was over. Andrew left the building at the pace of a man with nothing left in his legs. He had not been given a single opportunity to share what he knew. He did not know whether the warning he had managed to leave behind would be enough. After Andrew left, the operations floor continued functioning. The dashboards looked manageable from a surface reading. The isolation layers he had installed overnight were quietly absorbing irregular traffic, keeping the most sensitive processes stable in a way that was invisible unless you understood what you were looking at. To Olivia and the supervisors joining her morning briefings, the system running normally in Andrew's absence seemed to confirm the logic of the decision. If nothing had broken yet, there had been nothing urgent to begin with. She moved through her scheduled meetings with focused energy, outlining expectations for each department head in language that was precise and unambiguous. She talked about accountability, structural efficiency, and cultural transformation. Some people left those meetings feeling energized. Others left with a formless unease they could not articulate. Nobody in those rooms had a clear enough picture of what Andrew had been doing to know how to interrupt her. In the technical department, the atmosphere was heavier. A few engineers who had worked alongside Andrew for years were quietly furious and equally powerless. Some of them had already opened the internal repository folder where he had stored his working notes. The files were dense with technical shorthand, written in the compressed language of someone working at speed without time to format anything for an outside reader. There were warning annotations, patch references marked with notations specific to Andrew's own documentation system, and several explicit flags that stood out even to someone who only half understood the context. Nobody there had the full picture. They each had pieces, and the pieces did not yet form something actionable. Shortly before noon, a processing cluster began showing elevated latency, transactions backed up in the queue, taking several seconds to clear instead of fractions of a second. The on-duty supervisor, recognizing familiar patterns of congestion, began to notice a pattern of congestion, made the assessment that a service restart would clear whatever memory buildup was causing the slowdown. It was a standard tool he had used dozens of times. As he prepared the command, Daniel hesitated. "He told us not to restart it," Daniel said, quietly enough that it almost was not said at all. The supervisor's expression flickered with impatience. "He's been terminated. That settled it." In the practical logic of institutional hierarchy, a dismissed employee's final words the approximate weight of a stranger's opinion. The restart command executed. Andrew reached home in a state that was somewhere between conscious and not. His phone had accumulated messages from work contacts he no longer had standing to respond to, and he left them unread. He found Chloe at the kitchen table working through arithmetic problems with focused seriousness. He managed something close to a smile, and then the sofa claimed him. He did not take off his jacket. He placed the open laptop beside him, its screen still cycling through remote monitoring displays, and was asleep before he had decided to be. The restart executed at 12:47 in the afternoon, during the early peak of the business day's second trading window. In the first minutes, there was a misleading improvement. Queue times dropped, congestion patterns smoothed. The supervisor exhaled. Then the authentication tokens went. Asynchronous. It happened in waves. The first sign was a cluster of transaction sessions reporting unexpected state mismatches, payments showing as uninitialized, as if they had never begun. The token synchronization service lost its connection to the primary routing pathway, the token pathway, the moment the restart cleared the memory state where Andrew's temporary logic had been running. The isolation barriers collapsed. The dormant trigger fired. What followed was quiet, technical, and deeply frightening too. Anyone who understood the numbers on screen. Outbound transaction routing began redirecting a subset of traffic toward endpoints outside Aurelius Pay's verified network. Reconciliation for a category of corporate transfers failed silently. Several high-value payment instructions entered a suspended state that was neither completed nor cleanly reversible. The monitoring systems, missing the bridging logic Andrew had built, could not correctly assess whether the anomalies were internal errors or active manipulation. Engineers worked at a pace that was fast enough to be impressive and not fast enough to keep up with the deterioration. They attempted rollbacks. The rollbacks did not anchor correctly because the system state they were targeting had never been formally documented. It had been a functional construction built live, under pressure, by a single person who was no longer present. They attempted to isolate the affected nodes, but the interdependencies Andrew understood intuitively were not mapped anywhere accessible. Someone pulled up his repository notes and read them aloud to the group gathered around the primary console. The notes described the current failure mode with remarkable precision. Understanding them fully enough to reverse what was happening was a different matter entirely. Olivia was called down from the executive floor. She walked into the operations center for the second time that day and found a room that had been transformed. The monitors were overwhelmingly red. Engineers moved between stations with the tight urgency of people who know exactly how serious something is and are afraid to name it plainly. Calls from enterprise clients were already coming in. She asked what was happening. A senior engineer turned from his console, face pale and composed in the way of someone who has decided to say the true thing. It looks like he was holding the entire system together by hand for 2 days. We just deactivated all the defensive layers he built. The phrase he used did not require a name. Everyone in the room knew. Olivia asked if they could fix it. She asked who understood Andrew's patch logic. She asked where the CTO was and what the CTO's working knowledge of the legacy infrastructure looked like. The answers she received did not comfort her. The CTO was strategically strong and operationally thin in precisely the areas that mattered now. The engineers present knew enough to work the problem, but not enough to work it at the depth and speed the situation required. The documentation that should have existed for systems this critical had never been written or was years out of date. The company was bleeding, and the only person who fully understood its circulatory system had been escorted from the building that morning. Olivia read Andrew's notes from beginning to end at an empty workstation. In the repository folder Daniel had flagged, there was a consolidated log file, time-stamped patch notations, and a plain text summary written like field notes by someone who had not expected to have time to revise them. At the bottom of the final page, in a font size slightly larger than the rest, was a line that had evidently been added last. If I am no longer available, do not restart the core services under any circumstances. This is not a performance issue. This is a staged attack waiting to be triggered. Call me first. He had left a phone number. Nobody had called it. The engineers around her were doing their best work, and their best work was not going to be enough, and they all knew it. Olivia closed the file. She sat for a moment with her hands flat on the desk. The feeling arrived and would not be briefly processed and set aside. She thought about the morning Andrew's face when he tried to speak, the specific urgency he had been carrying. She had not misread it as insignificant. She had dismissed it before reading it at all. She had been so certain she understood what she was looking at that she had refused to look. She asked HR for his home address. The file was sparse, and it took several minutes of searching through emergency contact records before a current address was confirmed. She called 3 times. The phone rang without answer each time. His body, she understood, might genuinely be unable to hear it. She picked up her keys, walked to the parking structure, and drove herself to the address on the screen. The building was in a quiet, ordinary neighborhood, older construction, a place where people lived rather than performed living. Olivia stood briefly outside her car, registering the gap between where she had spent the last several hours and where she was standing now. Then she walked to the apartment door and knocked. No answer. She knocked again, louder. She was reaching for her phone when the door opened and a child stood in the space it revealed. Small, with slightly disordered hair and a stuffed rabbit tucked under one arm. The girl looked up at Olivia with the calm, assessing gaze of a child who has learned to read adult visitors quickly. "Are you looking for my dad?" Olivia did not answer for a moment. She had not known there was a child. It had not appeared in any context in which Andrew existed professionally because Andrew did not use his personal life as a credentialing device. He had never mentioned it. No one had mentioned it to her. Chloe opened the door wider when she determined the woman outside did not seem threatening. Inside the apartment, Andrew was lying on his side on the sofa, still wearing the same shirt from that morning, his jacket still on. The laptop was open beside him, lock screen still cycling. One shoe had been removed, the other was still on his foot. A glass of water he had apparently poured and forgotten sat on the low table, untouched. Several empty takeout containers on the kitchen counter marked the meals of a person eating without attention across multiple days. He had the stillness of a person who had not chosen to stop but had simply run out of anything left to give. Chloe lowered her voice the way children do when the sleep nearby is genuinely needed. "Daddy hasn't really slept. He said something bad was happening at work. He promised he would rest after he fixed it." The words were simple and factual and landed in Olivia's chest like something physical. She looked at the apartment, the careful economy of it, the evidence of a life organized around necessity and love, and thought about every assumption she had carried into the operations center that morning. The image she had constructed in 10 seconds, the certainty she had felt, the complete and total wrongness of it. She asked softly whether Chloe was alone. The girl said a neighbor would come over soon and that her father had only fallen asleep after he got home. Olivia understood with a clarity that was almost physical what she had done. She had not simply made a bad call. She had removed at the worst possible moment the man, silently carrying the weight of the company's survival. And she had done it because the image of him sleeping had fit so neatly into the story she had already decided to tell. She touched Chloe's shoulder once, gently, and asked if she could wake him. It took several attempts before Andrew surfaced. He came back to consciousness in layers, the way profoundly sleep-deprived people do. When he recognized Olivia standing in his living room, his first expression was not anger. It was the specific exhaustion of a person who has just been handed one more demand they did not ask for. He sat up slowly. He said nothing. Olivia sat in the chair across from him. She did not arrange her words carefully or build toward anything gradually. I didn't listen to you this morning. I fired you before I understood what was happening. I need to apologize for that. Andrew looked at her without speaking. He was not withholding the response strategically. He was simply not in a place where accurate words changed what he was feeling. She continued because the situation did not allow her to wait. They restarted the system. It's failing. Nobody in the building understands your patch logic well enough to stop it. Andrew closed his eyes for a moment. Not shock. Just the particular heaviness of being right about something you had hoped not to be right about. He reached for the laptop and pulled up the remote monitoring interface. The metrics loaded, and he scanned them for less than 60 seconds before setting the laptop back down. The numbers confirmed what Olivia's face had already communicated. He did not stand up immediately. He looked at Chloe first, asked whether she had eaten, whether she had finished her schoolwork, whether Mrs. Harmon from down the hall had confirmed she was coming over. Chloe answered each question with a composed patience of a child who understood that her father was being asked to go back to something difficult and was not going to make it harder. She said yes too. All three. Something passed between them that did not require words. Then he looked at Olivia. I'm going back because if the breach completes, real people, customers, businesses, workers who depend on those payment systems will pay for mistakes that belong to this organization. That's the reason, not the apology, not the job. He stood, changed his shirt, said a quiet word to Chloe, picked up his laptop and jacket, and walked to the door. He looked back at his daughter once. Chloe waved with the stuffed rabbit's paw. Andrew almost smiled. Then they drove back to headquarters in silence. When Andrew walked back into the operations center, the room changed in a way that was not quite describable, but was immediately felt by everyone present. Not celebration, something closer to the specific relief of a group of people who have been managing a problem beyond their capacity and have just seen the person with the relevant capacity come back through the door. He did not acknowledge the shift. He moved directly to the primary console, took the seat someone vacated without being asked, and began a rapid assessment of current system state. He asked for full log access, current architecture diagrams, and a verbal summary of every intervention the team had attempted since the restart. He listened without interrupting. When the summary finished, he was quiet for approximately 8 seconds. Then he started distributing the work. He put 5 people on isolating the anomalous outbound connections, carefully redirecting them into a controlled observation environment rather than blindly blocking them. He sent 2 engineers to construct a mirror pathway tracking exactly where redirected transaction data was being channeled. He asked a 3rd group to prepare a controlled failover for the highest value processing queue. He asked someone from the legal team to contact the 3 largest enterprise clients with a scripted message acknowledging a temporary technical issue without triggering contractual escalation clauses. He asked one person to do nothing except record every command he issued in order. The distribution of the work was its own kind of demonstration. Andrew was not performing mastery. He was executing a plan he had been developing mentally for 48 hours, adapting it in real time to a situation that had deteriorated further than he had hoped. He understood the system the way only continuous intimate contact produces, not just how it was designed to function, but how it had evolved into something different from the design and what that evolution meant under stress. Over the following 90 minutes, the bleeding slowed. The anomalous routing pathway was severed from its connection to the core payment layer. 3 suspended high-value transactions were isolated and quarantined before any funds transferred outside verified was identified and neutralized through 17 specific changes to the authentication configuration that closed the door the attackers had built and removed the key from the lock. There were losses. Several smaller transaction batches would require manual reconciliation. 2 enterprise clients would receive formal incident notifications. The security audit that followed would be extensive and expensive, but the catastrophic outcome, a large-scale diversion of corporate funds, followed by public disclosure of a failure of that magnitude, had been averted. When Andrew confirmed that the authentication layer had restabilized, Intrusion pathway was permanently closed. The room released a collective breath. Olivia, who had stood at the edge of the working area for the entire duration, felt the tension leave her in a wave that was almost dizzying. The emergency review was called within the hour. Department heads, the CTO, and the board's technical liaison gathered in the main conference room. The incident report was presented in full. Andrew had detected the intrusion first, 2 days before anyone else. He had reported it through proper channels and been effectively told to wait. He had worked for 48 hours to hold the infrastructure together. He had been terminated before he could brief the incoming CEO. His explicit warning had been dismissed after his dismissal. The restart had been performed, and the result had been exactly what he predicted. Several people in the room began reaching for the careful language organizations produce when they want to distribute responsibility broadly enough that no single failure point becomes too visible. Process gaps, communication breakdowns, understandable given the circumstances of the transition. Olivia recognized the language because she had used it herself in other rooms. She understood its function, and she understood that using it now would be a direct repetition of the failure that had produced the crisis. She stood. This morning I fired Andrew Foster before I had heard a single complete sentence from him. I made that decision based on an image that confirmed what I had already decided to believe. I was wrong, and my error came close to costing this company something that would not have been recoverable. I am sorry to Andrew, and in front of all of you. The room was quiet in the way that rooms become quiet when something true and costly has been said plainly. Andrew, seated at the far end of the table, gave a single small nod. He did not accept the apology with visible warmth or perform forgiveness for the room. He received it with the quiet of a person who has set something heavy down, not because it was resolved, but because continuing to hold it served no one. In the weeks that followed, the board moved quickly on Andrew's professional standing. There were offers of immediate promotion, significant compensation adjustments, and a newly created role overseeing infrastructure security operations at an organizational level that would have given him the authority his expertise had always warranted, what he negotiated first, before any title or number was finalized, was a set of structural changes. He asked for a revised escalation protocol guaranteeing frontline engineers a direct path to executive leadership when reporting security concerns, a path that could not be blocked by middle management protecting its own comfort. He asked for shift rotation standards in the operations center, making it structurally impossible for any person to become a single point of failure through exhaustion. And he asked for a formal policy protecting engineers who raise genuine risk alarms from any professional penalty for doing so. When he presented these requests to the board, the room was very still. Everyone present understood what they were looking at. A man who had been handed a significant amount of institutional leverage and had chosen to spend most of it on policies that would protect the next person in his position from being destroyed the way he had almost been destroyed. Olivia accepted everything without modification. The change that mattered most was not in any document. It was in how she led. Her decisiveness remained. Her standards stayed high, but something in the way she moved through the organization shifted. She slowed down in the moments that required listening. She began arriving in departments not to inspect, but to ask questions, and she learned to ask the kinds that made people feel safe enough to answer honestly. She began to recognize with increasing reliability the difference between someone who talked loudly about their work and someone who was quietly holding something essential together. It was not a skill she had possessed before. It was one she had paid dearly to acquire. One afternoon, several weeks after the incident had been formally closed, Olivia came through the main lobby and noticed Andrew near the entrance. He was crouched slightly to adjust the strap on a small backpack, listening to Chloe with complete attention as the girl delivered a fast and emphatic account of something that had happened at school. His face, which Olivia had seen under pressure for an entire day and memorized as controlled and precise, was entirely different now. Open, soft, lit from within in a way that professional competence does not produce. He was not a man in a building. He was a father at the end of a long day, and that was all he needed to be. Olivia stood back and did not approach immediately. She had learned to recognize the moments that belonged to other people. After a moment, she walked over not as the chief executive without any agenda. She held out a small stuffed rabbit, the worn one she had noticed on the apartment floor during her visit and found in her coat pocket 2 days later, apparently slipped in by Chloe during the confusion of Andrew being woken. She had meant to return it sooner. Chloe's face arranged itself into immediate delight. She took the rabbit and tucked it under her arm with the satisfaction of recovering something important. Andrew looked at Olivia. There was no unresolved tension in the look, and no performed warmth either. It was the look of two people who had come through something difficult from opposite sides, and arrived unexpectedly at a version of mutual understanding that neither of them had planned for. Between them, there was no declaration, no clean ending. Only the particular texture of a relationship built entirely from hard truth, and the possibility, if both of them were willing, of something more honest than either had managed to build before. The story ended there in the ordinary brightness of a lobby in the late afternoon with a contretenue, with a child holding a stuffed rabbit and two adults standing close enough to see each other clearly. A man who had been publicly diminished had been publicly restored in the same building before many of the same people. A woman who had entered power certain of her own clarity had learned the most expensive lesson of her professional life, that authority exercised without the willingness to listen is not strength. It is a specific and very costly kind of blindness, and somewhere in the space between those two facts, in the complicated quiet that follows a crisis, once the crisis has finally passed, something fragile and real had begun.